All right. Well, welcome everybody. Have a seat. We're going to try to start on time because we need to end on time. My name is Jack Neely. I'm with the Knoxville History Project. Every third Thursday of the month, we do a Zoom presentation, a free Zoom, and you can sign up for any of them every month and a different subject every time. This is the first time we've ever had a Zoom with a live audience. I suspect it may be the last time too, but it's a complicated thing to try to do. But anyway, I'm here to talk about Clarence Brown, he's a fascinating figure. I hope you've read or seen or heard of the book by Gwenda Young, who's here this weekend to talk about her book, Hollywood's Forgotten Master. Gwenda Young goes into great detail about what made Clarence Brown kind of a genius in Hollywood, in great detail into each of his movies and how he put them together. She has a few pages about his youth in Knoxville, but not a whole lot. And it seemed to me it was important to try to find out what made Clarence Brown. And I want to try to go back and look at his youth here and find out more about that. His youth here, he had most of his formal education here in Knoxville, including his time at UT. He was, of course, born in Massachusetts, was in a small town, was moved here with his father and mother when in about 1901 or 1902, and lived right in this neighborhood. So we're having this event tonight in Clarence Brown's own neighborhood. They lived in 4 different houses in Knoxville, and all of them were within spitting distance almost of this movie theater. This is where he arguably started his career in showbiz and interesting and surprising ways, and also where he got all of his training as an engineer, which is what Gwenda Young says made him distinctly different and better than many of the directors in Hollywood at the time. It's not enough just to say that he was a UT alum. That's what people always say. He's a UT alum, had 2 degrees in engineering, 1910. But I wanted to find out more about that. So that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. They moved here in 1902. His father was they had lived in Massachusetts, but his father was from an old Georgia family. They had been in the textile mill business for generations, and moved here in 1902 to work for Knoxville's most famous textile mill. We had 2 great big textile mills and about 7 or 8 medium-sized ones. Surprisingly, in Knoxville, that we had that textile was such a big deal here. But Brookside was very close to where we are now. It was just about a quarter mile back that way, and was a weaving mill. It was kind of a specialty mill but they I guess we can advance Paul if he might be working on it. So I'll just talk about what they did here. But it was a weaving mill, did specialty jobs. They did velvet, they did corduroy, they did lots of different things that ordinary knitting mills can't do. Larkin Brown, Clarence Brown's father, was a mill guy, but he was mainly known as a loom repairman at the time that they arrived here. And it's remarkable, his own career is remarkable, and he would hold a book in itself, because he came here as almost a Horatio Alger type story of rising from complete obscurity to becoming a leader of Brookside Mills. Paul, I assume we're having issues with this. Oh, good. Great. I'm really good. Yeah, but let's move to the next one. Yeah, here we go. This is what Brookside Mills looks like. That's a big factory, and that it had perhaps as many as 2,000 employees at one time. This was it was considered a very progressive factory at the time. They had gardens inside. They had kind of a daycare sort of a system. But this is where Larkin Brown came from his previous mill job in Massachusetts, and apparently impressed the powers that were at Brookside to hire him. But he was not very well known here. It's very hard to find any references to the father in the early days here. But this was, probably the premium mill in this region. Standard was over there, but they made T-shirts and things, and they did a good job with that. But this was kind of they at least thought of themselves as better than all the other mills. But anyway, I want to talk a little bit about. It was built in 1885, by the way. It was there for quite a long time. And where we are right now, the Happy Holler area, is the Milltown district. This is the area that they grew up to serve the mill workers who lived close by. Why? Because of course they didn't have cars then, and most mill workers didn't have horses either, so they need to live within walking distance of work. A lot of factories were like that. Knoxville is kind of a collection of mill towns in a way. But yeah, it's kind of a pretty place. They don't make pretty factories anymore. But this is Brookside Mills as it was in its heyday. But I want to talk about Knoxville a little bit at the time too. Knoxville was a mainly industrial city in 1902, and we have a picture of a Gay Street next. This is a picture of Gay Street at about the time that the Browns moved here. It was a city of about 35 to 40,000 people, which doesn't sound very big until you realize that all these people lived pretty close to downtown. Sequoia Hills was way out in West Knox County at this time. They didn't count Sequoia Hills. They didn't count anything in South Knoxville as part of Knoxville. So Knoxville was all pretty much what we think of as kind of central downtown area in Knoxville. People live within walking distance of Market Square, basically. But this is a great picture of Gay Street, and that's the old Imperial Hotel on the right. It burned down after Clarence Brown left town. But this is looking south. That's what is that, Clinch, I guess, Avenue crossing this way, but looking north rather, looking north toward where the Sturkey building would be in the distance, but it wasn't there yet. But you see, I love these old pictures of people sharing streets with horse and buggies. But next one, Paul. Yeah, here's the Southern Railway Station was being built at the time that the Browns lived here. Southern Railway was a fairly recently put together railway by J.P. Morgan. He created Southern Railway, combining a Knoxville-based railroad called the East Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia with a couple of other big railroads. And Knoxville became kind of central to the railroad business of Southern. The Coster shops were built not too far from where we are right now to service the Southern Railway. So this was a very railroad-oriented area, and of course the railroad is right behind us. And there's a lot about the railroad that Clarence Brown uses in his movies. There's a discussion of the movie Possessed with Joan Crawford, which has a great scene that I've never seen duplicated of multiple train cars going by, and you can look in and see the people who don't have much could look in and see the lifestyles of what they would like to be by looking at the people in the windows of the passenger cars. And I wonder whether Clarence Brown actually saw that from about where we are now, looking at the passenger cars leaving town. But kind of a rolling picture of a better life. But next we have a picture of the Market House, and you've probably seen pictures of this. This is Market Square, and of course the Market House, which was fairly new at the time. It was about 5 years old when the Browns lived here. But the Market House had all kinds of things in it. It had the market stalls inside, but the second floor had a great big auditorium, 1,000-person auditorium, and they had some performances in there. And interestingly, Clarence Brown's father was on the committee to welcome Calvin Coolidge to town in 1920, and that he gave a speech in the market hall at that time. But this was the center of a lot of people's lives. Market Square, everybody went to Market Square, regardless of race or age or rich or poor. Everybody went there, and it was this was something that Clarence Brown certainly would have been very familiar with. And in the next picture, we have another building was being built at the time that the Browns arrived here. The Miller's building, that was a brand new department store building on the left there. Looking down Gay Street, and this is looking down the 400 block of Gay Street. And you see Woodruff's in the background. The Woodruff's building, of course, is still there. A lot of those buildings are still there today. But this was somewhere about halfway down the block was the studio of Laura Fogelsong, who played a big role in Clarence Brown's early youth, and we'll talk about her a little bit more later. Laura Fogelsong was a woman who well, actually we'll talk about her in just a minute. But next one, please. And this is where we are right now, and this is if you can see, this is it says Cotton Mill, which is really Brookside, but we're looking up and down Central Street, and this is his neighborhood basically, and we see that place up there is is Baxter Avenue. That's their second home in Knoxville, was on Baxter Avenue. That's about where. And here's this. We just found this yesterday, thanks to our friend Brent Minchie. Just happened to find this. There's a new bunch of pictures of streetcars lines being built, and people are interested in them, not so much for the streetcar lines, but for what you can see on the sides of the pictures. And this is one of the more interesting pictures. This is looking down into Happy Holler. This is where we are on the left here, looking northwest on Central, looking down that way. And you can see there's some buildings on this side, but not so many on that side, I think. But this is Baxter Avenue here. And this is where the Three Rivers Market is today. But in that parking lot are these two houses. In the second house over that way, that house on the right, that's the Browns' second home. That's in 1904. That's exactly when they lived there. So it's remarkable that just yesterday we found a picture, the only picture I've seen from the time that they lived in one of their houses of that house itself. But they lived across the street diagonally, and this is just a remarkable coincidence, unless it was planned somehow, from a woman named Laura Fogelsong, who was a trained, musically trained, dramatically trained teacher who taught trained and taught in schools in Pittsburgh. She lived in Ohio. She'd been all over the place. She was pretty well thought of and advertised herself as a teacher of dramatic recitations. And by the time Clarence Brown was in his first year in Knoxville, he was known for dramatic recitations. He worked with Laura Fogelsong, studied with her, and this was something he did, and they were very proud of. Interestingly, Clarence Brown was famous before his father was, or his mother, in Knoxville. You see his name a lot by the time he's 12 years old here, because he's giving dramatic recitations. This was one of a fascinating era when there were lots of different kinds of live entertainment going on. But this was one thing that some people were good at, and he would get up, and it was kind of the grandfather of the stand-up comic, maybe. But he would tell dramatic, sometimes tear-jerking, sometimes very funny recitations, and it was always funny to see this kid who was small for his age and was very young too. But as an adult, I think he was 5'7", but he was very small as a kid, and he didn't mind if people thought he was cute. Yeah, here are pictures of him. He didn't mind that people thought he was cute. Apparently, he didn't run away from that. They say that he wore short pants to school and didn't care. But he often he could easily have been called a sissy. He joined a lot of clubs that had mostly girls in them, and just kind of learned to act that way, because girls seemed to be more interested in dramatic stuff than boys were. But it's surprising because he had both sides of his character, and we see this very complex character starting to form during this time. But he was it's fascinating to just watch his character develop. But let's look at the next one, please.
You want to talk about Jim?
This church, yeah. This is the Third Presbyterian Church. A lot of people may not know where that was, on Fifth Avenue. Third Presbyterian Church, and this was one of his early he was actually did two performances there in 1903, and one was about he gave a presentation about the subject of India, which is, I would love to find out more about that. But it was he did a lot of performances in churches, in schools, occasionally in theaters. Often alongside older actors and some people who would later become important performers, including a woman named, in those days, known as Bertha Roth, later known as Bertha Walburn Clark. If you might recognize that name because she's the founder and first conductor of the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra, one of the very first symphony orchestras, and very few symphony orchestras in America to have been founded by a woman. But she was a violin performer at the time that Clarence Brown was here from Cincinnati, and she was, and they sometimes were on the same stage together. Another woman was Lillian McMillan, who's also known as Dorothy South. She was a sometime Broadway performer, and she was sometimes on the same stage with Clarence Brown. He was kind of adored in Knoxville, all over the place, and really recognizable to people. People would look forward to him and to seeing him, and we there are lots of he got a lot of good notices by the time he was 15 years old. He'd been called one of the best performers in Knoxville by the time he was 15 or so. But it's a fascinating era, as I mentioned, in terms of live music. This was the granddaddy of all venues was Staub's Opera House. Is that the next one? Oh yeah, here we're back to that. This is on Gay Street, and Staub's Opera House was right across the street from the Bijou Theater. It's where Plaza Tower is today. This was built by Peter Staub, the Swiss immigrant, in 1872, and it was an opera house. They had occasional operas there. They probably had more vaudeville, more performances of all kinds. Frederick Douglass spoke there once. W.C. Fields was there every year for a while. Who else? George M. Cohan, Sarah Bernhardt, Ethel Barrymore, and interestingly, a few other folks. Wallace Beery and Lionel Barrymore were both performing there at the time the Browns lived here. And I would love to think that they might have seen some of these performances, because both of those guys appeared in some Clarence Brown movies later on. These were just vaudevillians, Broadway stars at the time that they performed here. It was just a fascinating era of experimentation with live performance, vaudeville, Broadway musicals, musical recitals, recitations, debates, also something called the tableau vivant, which was an interesting thing of trying to, sometimes would try to recreate a famous painting with live people on the stage. And this was something that people would do, and it was, people didn't have TV at home or radio at home, and they just played with all kinds of things you could do on stage. And I think they're more inventive in 1905 than we are today. It was less predictable a night out, and you could see a different show every single night in Knoxville if you wanted to, except in the summertime when they closed everything because it was too damn hot to go into a theater. But anyway, this was also the place where Clarence Brown was when he graduated from high school in 1905. At the age of 15, he performed. He was already known as a performer 3 years or so after he arrived in town, and they had him perform a recitation of a funny, complex story called "How the LaRue Stakes Were Lost." And they say the city council men were up in the balcony of the Staub's Opera House guffawing at this hilarious kid on stage. This was a place that was very familiar to him at the time. And of course, right across the street was the Bijou, and this was finished when he was 18 years old, and so he would have been familiar with the Bijou Theater before he left town. This was, of course, what it looked like on the outside. They had vaudeville there on a regular basis. It was becoming, they hadn't started showing movies there much at the time. Interestingly, movie theaters were just catching on while Clarence Brown was at UT, studying at UT. We had shown movies in Knoxville to begin with at an outdoor park called Turner Park off of Broadway, and it was called, it wasn't named for something named Turner. It was the Turnverein, the German organization, sponsored these things, and they would show outdoor movies on sheets in the 1890s. So Knoxville was really early in adapting this new technology. People love movies here. Movies were also popular in brothels on South Central, and some of these, it's amazing. Some of these kind of entertainment centers is basically what they were, and they had motion pictures there. But they started showing movies just in little clips often as part of a vaudeville show and that sort of thing, because no movies were very long. Most of them were just 5 or 6 minutes long. But by the time Clarence Brown graduated from UT and left Knoxville, there were 5 dedicated movie theaters and some other theaters that sometimes showed movies in downtown Knoxville. But the Bijou was mainly for live vaudeville and occasionally Broadway shows. We have a picture of the very first night there. And I would love to get a grad student or somebody and study all the faces and see which one is Clarence Brown in this picture. But this is a fascinating show image. It looks like bigger than the Bijou today because they had more people in there. People sat closer together They didn't worry about fire code so much, and people were also smaller than they are now. But this was they were showing the Broadway show Little Johnny Jones. What was it about? But it was the Broadway show that introduced Give My Regards to Broadway, and Yankee Doodle Dandy was that Broadway show was maybe 2 or 3 years old at the time that it was performed here in Knoxville. And it's interesting to see this because the second balcony was reserved for Black patrons, and there are if you study those, there are several Black people in the second balcony. I think there's some white people too, but so it's that's the way they had it set up. But it's fascinating to see almost all these are men in the front, young men coming out to see a Broadway show, just sitting together. Anyway, it's that theater just gives us a sense of what this place was like in 1909, the day that opened. Next one, please. I mentioned that Clarence Brown didn't seem to be bothered by images, and he actually attended the girls' high school, it was called. And this was a public high school. I think the assumption was that boys would go to a private school. There were a couple of boys' private schools in town. But he went to this school when it's called the Girls' High School, as it was evolving into the Knoxville High School. I think they thought it was perhaps unfair to keep calling it Girls' High School when there were boys there too. So, but it was still mostly girls when Clarence Brown was attending Girls' High School. He said his favorite teacher was a woman named Molly Hayes, who was a single Catholic woman, much beloved, who sometimes lectured. She actually lectured on the subject of preservation in Knoxville in 1907. But when she died impoverished, and Clarence Brown was one of several people who helped erect her a monument at Calvary Cemetery, the Catholic cemetery on the east side of town. But one of the school had some interesting reputation because it was the school where Anne Armstrong taught. Anne Armstrong, known today as kind of a pioneer business executive. She worked for Kodak, Eastman for a while, Eastman Kodak, as an executive, and also wrote a couple of novels, including The Seas of God, which is set in Knoxville in 1915. There's a new book of her memoirs of Knoxville in the 1880s. It's fascinating to see. But another interesting person who was a student there was a woman named Ruth Hale. She graduated in 1902. From Rogersville originally, but Ruth Hale is the same Ruth Hale who is a feminist writer and in New York, who became one of the core members of the Algonquin Roundtable. She sat with Dorothy Parker and Robert Benchley and all of them every day and tried to figure out the world from there in the 1920s. But Ruth Hale was a 1902 grad of Girls High School, and I'm curious about her little brother Richard Hale. Who had a memorable role in, he started out as he wanted to be an opera singer, but he had such severe features. When he went to Hollywood, they decided he was a great character actor. So he was actually played a role in a Clarence Brown movie called Angels in the Outfield. He plays the atheist, if you ever get to see that movie, but very memorable role. Later on, he lived a long time and was still working as an old man. Was in a Star Trek in the 1960s. This guy that Clarence Brown may have known in Knoxville. We don't know for sure. But it just opened to boys when Clarence Brown attended. He probably attended only 1 year before he graduated, and that was a surprise to me. He had attended a public school here just around the corner here before that. He went to UT in 1905 and at the age of enrolled at the age of 15. And at this time, there were only 300 or 400 students at UT. UT was literally about 1% of the size it is today. But it was strictly just up on the hill. It was kind of a fascinating place. It was kind of an acropolis of thinkers because I think the faculty and the student ratio was such that I think that it's never had such high quality faculty with so few students. But many of the faculty are well remembered today, and some nationally. Here's a picture of UT at that time, and looking up at the hill, but hadn't changed a whole lot that much. That view. Next one, please. Yeah, here's the picture of the old Science Hall, which was torn down, I'm sorry to say, a long time ago, kind of a Victorian sort of building. I'm sure Clarence Brown was familiar with that building. It's kind of sad. There's only one building on campus today that Clarence Brown knew that's still there, and that's South College. Next one, please. Yeah, here's a upper view of and this is all of UT. That's the top of the hill. That's what UT was in that time. And UT was not that famous. It was not. You didn't see it mentioned in the paper every day. It was not. But they did. They tried hard, and they were doing interesting stuff, as you'll see in a minute. But next one, please. I want to point out this is a picture of the faculty. We think about, where did he get this engineering degree, this engineering knowledge that he used in Hollywood later. And I wanted to look at the faculty who was teaching at UT at the time. There are several interesting folks that we bring up, especially the guy in the middle. We wrote a piece about that's in one of our last books about Brown Ayres. We all know the name Ayres Hall, but Brown Ayres was a fascinating guy who had been a major figure in New Orleans back in the 1880s and 90s. He had advised about the first electric trolleys in New Orleans. He had shown off the first X-ray ever done in New Orleans. He did astral photography of eclipses and things. He had worked with Thomas Edison. He worked closely with Alexander Graham Bell in his early demonstration of the telephone. He had what else? But he also done radio demonstrations, and this is really interesting. Brown Ayres did the first demonstration of a wireless radio broadcast in New Orleans. A couple of months later, when he was still a professor at Tulane, he had come to Knoxville and did the same thing here. The very first live radio broadcast was on the Hill, done by Tulane professor Brown Ayres. 2 years later, UT hired him to be president of UT. It must have been an impressive demonstration. But he in 1904 became he was an administrator. Was often caught in political issues and fundraising and all the things that the presidents have to deal with. But he also taught engineering, so we know that he taught Clarence Brown engineering. We also know that he knew Clarence Brown because Clarence Brown was dating his daughter. This was Elizabeth Ayres was Clarence Brown's girlfriend here. So if you know anything about the way fathers think now and the way they thought in 1905 or so, they got to know each other very well, I think. And I can't help but think that Brown Ayres was an inspiration to Clarence Brown in the way that he thought about things. He had just a wide-ranging brain to think about what you can do with electricity and how it can solve engineering problems. Another professor well known for engineering was Charles Perkins, and it's interesting how many people who are teachers of Clarence Brown have buildings named for them today. Perkins Hall is an engineering hall there, but that's Charles Perkins. He was the expert on electrical engineering at UT. And I don't know if he knew more than Brown Ayres did, but he was that was his role. Next one is Charles Ferris, another guy who has a building named for him. Charles Ferris was a major figure in UT and Knoxville history. He spent time in Michigan and Ohio before he came here. He had studied at McGill in Montreal. But he taught both, interestingly, this two-sided brain kind of guy. He taught both machine design and freehand art. The idea that an engineer needs to be a good artist, but he was their art teacher as well at the same time. So the same guy was teaching both things. He later wrote a manual for engineers and for a national market. It went through 25 editions. One of my books has gone through 2 editions. So Charles Ferris was later quoted about Clarence Brown as an old man. Charles Ferris remembered him well. He said he's a very immature but very keen fellow, and he was proud that they'd had a conversation one time, and Ferris said that engineering had been a great help to him in Hollywood, where a technical knowledge of power, machinery, and lights was a great advantage to the director. Ferris, by the way, had played in one of UT's earliest football teams back when they allowed faculty to play on the team, and was later a leader in the massive engineering effort to build finally a regulation football field in 1919 that became known as Shields-Watkins Field, the same field we we use today was built, directed by Charles Ferris, who was one of Clarence Brown's favorite professors, apparently. But another guy is Cooper Schmidt, who was a math professor and much beloved guy, which is surprising for a math professor, but was a very popular teacher. I just mentioned it briefly, he died after collapsing during a lecture at South College in 1910, a few months after he spoke at Clarence Brown's graduation. There's a memorial plaque to him at the Austin P building. And by the way, Cooper Schmidt's son is named Bernadotte Schmidt, and he became a Rhodes Scholar who left UT just as Clarence Brown was arriving there to take up his Rhodes Scholarship. And he was later a Pulitzer Prize winner in history. He won the Pulitzer Prize for history in 1930. But he finished at UT the year Clarence Brown started. The house in Fort Sanders that was moved from White to Clinch is the Cooper Schmidt house. That's where both Cooper and Bernadotte Schmidt lived. That was UT was going to tear it down, but thanks to Knox Heritage and it's a very enterprising developer, it was willing to move the house all the way over to Clinch Avenue. So it was moved about 3 blocks away and reinstalled in a different place. So you can actually see the house where Cooper Schmidt lived. Unfortunately, the house where Dr. Ferris lived was right next door, and it was torn down. Anyway, it's another person on this map is a name you might recognize, and that's that of James Hoskins. He was at that time a young history and economics professor who, of course, became the president of UT from 1933 to 46. He was, and of course, Hoskins Library is named for this guy. Next we have Harcourt Morgan, who's down here. He was, I don't know if he would have had any classes with Clarence Brown. He was an entomologist and mainly an agriculture professor. But he's worth mentioning. He's Canadian-born scientist who had known heirs down in Louisiana. But he was president of UT from 1919 to 1933 when he resigned from UT to become one of the original 3 directors of the Tennessee Valley Authority at the time that TVA was internationally kind of famous. Harcourt Morgan was one of the original triumvirate of TVA. So he was this is a high flying bunch of characters here who are just it's an impressive cadre of kind of wide ranging thinkers who Clarence Brown would have known on the hilltop in those days. But also in that group is a guy named Philander P. Claxton, who is an education professor. And we have him, don't we? Okay, yeah, he's at the top. Yeah, right up there. There we go. Yeah. And he's worth mentioning for one, he was active in the Philomathesian Society, of which Clarence Brown was a member. So we know that they knew each other that way. But Philander Claxton had a remarkable contribution to education and to UT. UT was not used in the summertime, so they decided to have a giant event that was even bigger than the 300 or 400 students who came there in the winter. And that was to invite thousands of public school teachers to come to UT campus and study at what they called the Summer School of the South. And they say that 32,000 teachers came to events there over a period of 9 years. This was a time, it was what the Summer School of the South was kind of I think it was kind of an intellectual Bonnaroo. It was kind of it was like a whole lot of options to hear lectures by famous scientists, explorers, philosophers, authors on the top of the hill. And that's why Brown Ayres came here from Tulane, was during the Summer School of the South in 1902 when he was showing off their radio. But this was a very exciting thing to see. And it was mainly for these public school teachers. Philander Claxton's idea was to kind of increase the breadth and kind of the cosmopolitan knowledge of the teachers of the South, who often had a very limited perspective on the world if they were from a country town or something. But they would come here and they would meet people like John Dewey and Jane Addams from Chicago and William Jennings Bryan and Carl Sandburg, and all these people came to the Summer School of the South and taught there. And at night they had entertainment, and that's when it was open to the public, and the public could come and hear watch actors and hear singers and violinists and so forth at this thing. It was it was held right in the quad area of the Ayers Hall, where they had a big makeshift building called Jefferson Hall, but they called it the Pine Palace. It was kind of an ugly building. They were just built of wood. It was kind of in the middle, but it was called Jefferson Hall. But it's really was just it looked like a temporary building, but people didn't care. It was some fascinating stuff was going on in there. But one particularly interesting thing is, and we learned a lot more about this by our colleague Paul Brown, who wrote a story about an actor named Charles Coburn, who was probably the single actor who performed most at the Summer School of the South. And he did a lot of Shakespeare in those days. He was a young actor from Georgia, and was doing a lot of Shakespearean stuff in there, and also believe it or not, did a presentation of Midsummer Night's Dream at Cherokee Country Club golf course. Well, see if they let you do that today. I would love to see that happen again. But Charles Coburn was an active, lively young guy who just spent every summer in Knoxville for a while. Later went on to Hollywood, became well known as a character actor there, and appeared in 3 different Clarence Brown movies. And I can't help but think that Clarence Brown might have seen Charles Coburn perform on the Top of the Hill. Maybe they've even met him, but they certainly used him in Hollywood. He was in Off Human Hearts, one of Clarence Brown's best known movies, but also Idiot's Delight. I've never seen that and would love to see it. Anyway, but other people that Clarence Brown knew here include at UT include, and this was interesting to see her picture in the yearbook. Our best known artist at this period of time was an impressionist painter named Catherine Wiley. She was teaching art at I think she actually replaced Ferris as a freehand drawing instructor. I think they decided he probably had engineering stuff they should be teaching instead of art. But she was teaching art on the Top of the Hill, and she was the best known impressionist painter from Tennessee in her time. Her work is at the Museum of Modern Art. But they had known each other. They probably knew each other before because they both had been involved in some community theater projects. She had painted landscapes for things that for presentations that Clarence Brown had performed in. But also wanted to mention these, even though they're not, they're kind of off the map of what Clarence Brown was probably studying. But a couple of lawyers, UT's School of Law was just developing at this time, and there are a couple of particularly notable lawyers who were people that Clarence Brown would have seen on the Hill. One of them is Edward Terry Sanford on the left. He was, at the time that Clarence Brown's first motion picture, Last Mohicans, 1920, this guy was being nominated to be a member of the U.S. Supreme Court. And he was a member of the Board of Trustees at UT. He was a teacher at UT. They probably would have, in such a small campus, they would have recognized each other at least. But also this guy over here, there's stories, older lawyers have stories about this guy. John R. Neal was a UT law professor, extremely eccentric guy, was known, had lots of habits that were unsavory, and was finally fired mainly for being a free thinker, I think, in the 1920s. But he was a law professor at the time Clarence Brown was there. Later on, he was the lead attorney for the John Scopes trial at Dayton. He worked with Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow is the famous guy in that trial, but John R. Neal was the lead attorney that enlisted Clarence Darrow. So these are people that he knew, that in this fascinating place that was UT in 1905, 1910. He was a member of this group I mentioned briefly called the Philomathesian Society. It was kind of an intellectual club at UT, and here's a picture of it from 1908, I think. By the way, that's Latin for never a step backwards, which I think is a great advice on the hill, especially the steep side of the hill. But this was he was also a member of what was called the Powder and Rouge Club. How many boys would be willing to be a member? But it was the drama club, and the drama club was all girls until Clarence Brown joined it. He was in some performances there, and I think his last performance ever in his whole life before a live audience was in 1909 when they did a performance of a Japanese play in in the Pine Palace on the quad. But I also want to mention another guy who was more of a man's man kind of guy, and that was Nathan Dougherty, who was a classmate of Clarence Brown. He was one of our first football heroes, but was also an engineer. They studied engineering together. Nathan Dougherty, I guess okay, yeah. It's but he was later was the dean of engineering for many years at UT, and the Dougherty Hall is named for him. But that was not a teacher, but a classmate. Actually, he was coming back as a teaching assistant for Clarence Brown's last year. They started out together, but Clarence Brown took longer because he got 2 degrees in engineering, got in electrical and mechanical engineering. So that certainly took longer. But others who graduated in Clarence Brown's class of 44 seniors include Jessie Harris. You might recognize that name from UT because she was a woman from Texas who became the first kind of the one who built up the what they call the School of Home Economics. Now not human ecology, I think, but it wasn't just teaching women to be good wives. She actually went to India and other places where they were having serious problems with people taking care of themselves, and was teaching what she had learned in home economics. Also in post-war Germany, she was over there as well. So she was going to trouble spots around the world, but she's honored with her name on a building today. Nanny Lee Hicks, who's familiar to the late Jim Tumblin, admired her as one of the greatest of all teachers at Central High School. But also W.P. Buck Toms, if you grew up in Boy Scouts in this area, Camp Buck Toms is named for one of the people who was at school with Clarence Brown. These are people he knew. Another guy, I was talking about last night at the Eugenia Williams house, and his name is John Fans Staub, who's the best known architect from Knoxville. He was younger than Clarence Brown, but they overlapped at UT. They both loved aviation. I don't doubt that they had some conversations. John Fans Staub, his best known work is in Texas and Houston especially. But he had left a couple of buildings here in his hometown, including a Hope Coat at UT and the Eugenia Williams house. But anyway, the Clarence Brown's graduation picture. Yeah, this is 1910. He got 2 degrees in electrical and mechanical engineering, and it's only these degrees. I think is just only a hint of what he might have learned on the Hill from all this disparate number of people who were working there. They often had graduations from UT at Staub's Opera House because they didn't have any big enough auditorium on campus but that year they decided to use the Pine Palace, and Clarence Brown graduated in the Pine Palace right on the quad on top of the hill. Anyway, I want to mention this next. That I would like to think that Clarence Brown attended the Appalachian Exposition of 1910. It was really just an astonishing thing to see a dirigible in Knoxville. That was a rarity, but even more rare was the first ever airplane landing ever seen in Knoxville, and that was landed at Cal Johnson's racetrack, just a quarter mile away from Chihuahua Park. Cal Johnson, the guy raised in slavery, who had a horse racing track and actually cut down a tree. They say he wept as he did it because he loved the tree, but he thought this was important to history to be able to land an airplane during the Appalachian Exposition. And Clarence Brown was such a big fan of aviation. He was a pilot himself and had some of his movies are about aviation. That I really hope that he was there to see this. That there was a Wright Flyer that was being landed and took off again that day. But anyway, it's a fascinating, just this whole realm of Knoxville at the time. I want to mention this was his last year in Knoxville. He is listed as a Knoxvilleian in 1911 as a living up on Scott Avenue with his family. But this is about the time that his father, interestingly, who had been laboring in anonymity, mostly at Brookside, was becoming locally famous. His father had become the superintendent of Brookside Mills, the whole factory. So he was in the news all the time, about this time, in the 1910s, 1920s. He was leading fundraising efforts for the Red Cross during World War I. He was leading pollution abatements, air pollution abatement programs, believe it or not, in 1911, 1912. And I did claiming that they were solving part of the pollution problems by scrubbing the smoke that came out of the enormously tall smokestack at Brookside Mills, which was also the subject of Clarence Brown's own engineering thesis at UT. He was involved in electrical improvements, road building. He was a member of the Knoxville Automobile Club, which later on took a leading role in the Smoky Mountains National Park movement. Larkin Brown was a familiar figure, and I mentioned he was on the committee to welcome Calvin Coolidge to Knoxville in 1920. He'd become a big shot after his son went away. And they stayed here up till 1926. He was approaching retirement age. 1926 was when Clarence Brown had been doing really well in movies. He'd had 3 big successes the year before, I think all 3 of which were being shown this weekend. The Signal Tower, Smoldering Fires, and I showed in this room a few days ago was the Goose Woman. But anyway, he was doing really well, and he decided, and The Eagle, of course, is going to be on Sunday night too with Rudolph Valentino, and I'll be introducing that movie. But I think The Eagle was the last movie that Clarence Brown's parents saw in Knoxville, and they showed that at the Riviera, which is the biggest theater in town at the time. This is before the Tennessee even opened, but they showed the Eagle in 1926, and the Clarence Brown's parents moved to Los Angeles and stayed not far away from where their son lived. But anyway, Clarence Brown didn't ever forget Knoxville, and he remembered it in one especially interesting ways. About 2 months ago, in this room, we showed a movie called Wilderness, which is based on Eugene O'Neill's only comedy, and it's based in we're on young people in a school setting. And Clarence Brown, who unlike a lot of directors, didn't like to deal with the Hollywood backlots and the sound stages. He liked to go on location if he could, and he went all the way across the country with his crew to shoot this in an authentic setting, which is small town New England, which is where it's set. And this was he resonated with this because his earliest memories were a small town Massachusetts. So he went to a town very close to where he was born in Massachusetts and shot the movie. But all the details from the movie, let's go to the next one, had to do with what he remembered about Knoxville. And this is an actual banner, a Knoxville High School banner. And these are actually the first image of the whole movie is another Knoxville High School banner, or maybe that's their first image. But you see these, they're like Easter eggs through the movie. There are about 7 or 8 different KHS banners that you see sometimes prominently, sometimes off in the side somewhere. But in 1935, when this movie came out, and it had Wallace Beery and Lionel Barrymore, again, people who had performed in Knoxville when Clarence Brown lived here, and a young kid nobody ever heard of named Mickey Rooney was in the movie. But he kept using these references to KHS in different ways, in such a way that his classmates who were still around there came en masse to the Tennessee Theater, about 25 or 30 of them, to watch this movie together. And they dissected it and decided that the whole thing was based on their memories, his memories of Knoxville High School, down to we have an interesting picture next. This is a dance scene. They think that he completely rebuilt the interior of the old girls' high school, aka Knoxville High School, on Union Avenue, and this kind of Victorian building with the kind of palatial building it really was. With the arched windows, and that they said even the piano was placed exactly where it was. And there are other scenes where you can see statues and things like that. They say those were all things that he remembered vividly, like a photographic memory of. And I think it was a particular night, in fact, in 1904, that he was remembering. Because they had a lot of recitations, and this was not in Eugene O'Neill's plays. They didn't have recitations. But a lot of the movie is very comical recitations of bad reciters, and this was something that Clarence Brown was very good at. Even though his friends said that he put himself in the play as this kind of diminutive, undersized kid doing a recitation of Poe's The Bells. But anyway, but they say even the class song that they sang was their class song from KHS. But it's probably his most personal movie, a very lighthearted movie, but it's fascinating to think of this as a kind of a vivid memory of Knoxville, even though it's set in New England. Anyway, later on, Katharine Hepburn said that Clarence Brown was a very unusual combination of artist and with a romantic streak, and an engineer who likes to learn how machines work and make things better. He was I think at the same time kind of a theater nerd and a gearhead in one brain. But every movie for him was an engineering project, as a good movie. Many good movies are, but especially Clarence Brown's movies are that way. But I appreciate your coming out tonight, and I hope this has been a technical success. Clarence Brown would be proud if it were. But we'll any questions? We have a few minutes, so yeah, no problem.
How unusual was it to go to school, college at age 15? Was that rare?
Yeah, a question about how many people went to college age 15. It was not typical, but it was not unheard of either. And in fact, at that time, I think Knoxville High School, you were a senior if you were in 10th grade. So most people were 16 or older when they went to college. He was 15, but he was a really smart kid. So I don't think anybody really turned his head, but he really does stand out in class pictures because he's small anyway. He looks like somebody's little brother or something in these pictures that he would go on various club meetings and trips and things like that, and it didn't mind being the little kid. But yeah, good question. Any other questions? All right. Well, we have a few images of Clarence Brown. He's directing Greta Garbo and Frederick March and Anna Karenina there, and Greta Garbo and we looked at this carefully. He's pointing at Hollywood. She's pointing at Sweden. So that's so I want to be over here, but A Flesh and the Devil, a silent, kind of a classic silent. There was a big hit for both of them. Yeah.
I'm just asking if anyone on Zoom has questions.
Yeah. Good question. And let's finish the slides and yeah. But these are, of course, he also played a role in discovering other talent. There's Clarence Brown right there, and here's Joan Crawford and Clark Gable on the side. But they were not major stars yet when Clarence Brown was working in them, but on their way there rapidly. We have another one. Yeah, and here are just some pictures of movies that are showing this weekend. Probably the best known one is National Velvet, is of course going to be on tomorrow at outside at UT. That'll be an interesting thing. And Smoldering Fires is tonight, so I look forward to that. Anybody on Zoom want to? We have a way to.
Ask him to send in that questions by text.
Yeah.
On the channel.
Yeah, how many people are on Zoom, by the way? Can you tell?
Clarence Brown lived in Maplehurst Park. I lived in this old coach house for years.
That's a good question. The question is, when did Clarence Brown live in Maplehurst Park? According to the records, he never lived there, but his parents did. But the funny thing is, later on, he would say that he lived there. So I wonder, his parents moved from Scott Avenue to Maplehurst in 1919, and they lived there until they left in 1926. But Clarence Brown later said that he lived there, and I wonder if he moved back for extended stays, and he thought of himself during that time as staying there. It was his Knoxville home when his parents were there. Yeah. So yeah. It was. I think his father they had to live close to the plant, but then when he did so well he could buy a car, he decided he wanted to live downtown and drove to the plant instead of walking there. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
A quick mention, we saw the picture earlier of Staub and Opera House.
Yeah. Stops, yeah.
Featured piano player from that mentioned that Rachmaninoff also played.
You're right. Rachmaninoff, Sergei Rachmaninoff performed there in the 1920s. The first time he was here, of course, the last time he played here, it was at UT at the Alumni Memorial. and that was the last time of his entire career. But I think it was 1926 or so. He was at Staub's. But interesting, Marian Anderson was there about the same time, like 12 years before she was banned from singing at Constitution Hall. It was actually a group of Black women who sponsored this. Sponsored her to perform at Staub's Opera House, and she apparently was popular. But yeah. Other questions?
Did you ever marry?
Yes, he married several times. Yeah, I think four times, and we know various amounts about the various wives. I think the first wife is kind of mysterious, but the others we know somewhat more about, and had a kid or two. But of course, after he left here. Other questions? All right. Well, thanks a lot, Joel. I really enjoyed this. Really.
Thank you, everybody. We're going to have a break about 15 minutes, set up Will for the thing. So go get popcorn, go get the bathroom.